Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. This is a place for vibrant discussions about mindfulness, movement practices, and ways to find more balance and presence in daily life. Here you'll find resources to help you progress on your path, as well as insightful conversations with mindful movement, yoga, meditation, and Dharma teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight embodied approaches to mindfulness and the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. This is episode 76, and today I want to go big picture and talk about a framework called the biopsychosocial spiritual model, or BPSS, that I believe helps us understand the full potential of mindful movement practice. It touches on the different types of benefits we gain from practicing, some of the ones we don't always think about, and I think it underlines why mindful movement deserves to be a priority if you're looking to increase your well-being. Also, I wanted to talk about this because if you teach mindful movement, I want you to see how important your classes are. Our culture can be pretty dismissive of those of us who teach mindful movement, meditation, and yoga, and things like that. And especially if that's what you've dedicated yourself to as a career, you probably find that people often don't know what to do with you. Like when you have to go to a cocktail party or something and introduce yourself to accountants, they're like, what? Our skills are honestly not very well understood or valued, and we might not even really understand the impact we can be having on our classes and communities, or how to talk about that in a way that really garners the respect that it probably should. So I'm always on the lookout for ways of expanding our thinking on this and finding better ways to describe what we're doing. The biopsychosocial spiritual model is one of those ways because it's a holistic framework for human health and well-being. Everything from medical conditions to mental health to chronic pain to addiction to burnout can be viewed through this multidimensional lens. I get really excited when I look at mindful movement through this model because I think it's rare to find something like an activity, an intervention, or a resource that addresses our full humanity, all the biopsychosocial and spiritual parts of us in the way that mindful movement can. If you're on my teacher trainings mailing list, you might be like, oh, this sounds familiar because I sent out a newsletter on this topic a few weeks ago, and I'll just expand on it even further here. And by the way, if you're not on that list, I send teaching ideas and thought provokers like maybe once or twice a month. So you can get on that list if you want. You can find the button for it on my website or go directly to the sign up page at movedtomeditate.yoga/teacher-training-interest-list, which I will link in the show notes. Don't you love it when someone reads a hyperlink out to you? Anyway, it might be best to just go find that link in the show notes or just go look for the button on my website. This is also a topic that we discuss in the mindful movement teacher training in our very first session together because I feel like it's such an interesting and important way to set the stage for what we're learning, practicing, and teaching. So if this way of looking at mindful movement intrigues you, talking about the BPSS and other different frameworks like that, the next round of MMTT, Mindful Movement Teacher Training, is starting up in October. It's coming right up. So if you're listening to this close to the time that I'm publishing this episode, there is still time to join us this year. If it's later, like who knows when you're listening to this, you can still learn more about the program at movedtomeditate.yoga/MMTT and get on that teacher trainings interest list so you'll be notified about the next time that the program is offered. All right, so back to the biopsychosocial spiritual model. I first came across this term in my yoga therapy studies, particularly in my training around working with people who have chronic pain. It comes up there because pain is quite complex and isn't just a biological experience or just a psychological experience. So people with pain really benefit from the holistic approach that yoga therapy can take to address the situation, just for example. But let's back up and talk about what the BPSS is and where it comes from. The biopsychosocial spiritual model is a framework for health and well-being that was developed in the field of Western medicine after decades, if not centuries, of less than holistic thinking, which was dominated by the biomedical model. And to some degree, it still is. But this term biopsychosocial was proposed as an alternative model by Dr. George Engel in 1977. And now some researchers have added the second S for the spiritual component. Other times, you do see the spiritual aspects folded in under the psychological part of the model because people get squirmy about that word spiritual, especially in public institutions, which means it doesn't always get its own S in the acronym. So sometimes you see this as the BPS or the BPSS, as I refer to it. In whichever form, the model points out interconnections between different facets of human experience and how all of these factors contribute to overall wellness or human flourishing. And it suggests that we need to attend to all of these different facets of ourselves rather than prioritizing some and rejecting others. This has been historically quite difficult in many fields. Just think about how much Western science prefers things that are tangible, measurable, and objective. It does not like to deal with the squishy, subjective stuff, which is how we end up with paradigms like the biomedical model that largely ignores the social aspect or the spiritual aspect. Too squishy. Maybe there's been some progress in especially integrating the psychological aspects, but arguably we're not all the way there yet. And not that this is only relevant to medicine and healthcare, but I'm guessing we're all familiar enough and have some experience in that arena to just kind of understand the example there, and especially because that's really where this model originated. And also, I do want to say, if you've listened to this podcast, you know that I love science, but I do acknowledge it doesn't always address or include everything that might be necessary for human well-being. So we need broader models like this. So let's flesh out this more holistic framework and break down what the components are of the BPSS. First, we have the B, the biological domain, which includes physical health and basically how your body feels. That would factor in things like your genetics, your nutrition, any movement and exercise you do, things like how well you're sleeping, and also the question of whether you have pain or illness or injuries, or if you live with physical tension, if you have a sense of vitality, or if you struggle with lack of energy. All of that is going to come up in this biological area of the model. That's pretty straightforward, right? This one is more familiar and tangible, I think. Then we have the psychological domain, the P in the acronym, which includes our thoughts, feelings, and mental health, how we relate to our moods, how resilient we are or aren't. And this is where I believe our intellect also, or our learning style, would fit in. This part of the model also addresses our sense of identity, personality, and self-understanding. Our history, from our traumas to the positive formative memories that we draw on for strength and for our sense of self. All of that is part of this P. It includes the question of how much maturity we have and how we've learned from our experiences, how much self-agency we have, and how we see ourselves in the world. And also, I think it includes some elements of what our inner life is like. How do we talk to ourselves? How do we relate to ourselves? And it also contains our relational skills with others. How well do we connect with and communicate with those around us? So this is all part of the psychological area of the framework. And I hope you're already thinking about how interconnected those first two domains are. Like, you can't really separate the B and the P completely. Like in the bio domain, if we don't get enough sleep, for example, and we have low energy, we go through the day like that, it can influence our mood, right? Which can influence our communication, and those pieces are within the psychological domain. So when we're tired and grouchy and snap at someone, we've got both the B and the P, and the S from social, already interconnecting just from that very simple example. So that brings us to the third area of the model, the first S, the social dimension. And this piece is really interesting because it reminds us that it's not just about this individual experience of being a body and a psyche and what's going on inside of us internally. We're also affected by what's outside of us in our social connections and the conditions of our society and culture. There is so much evidence connecting health and longevity with the quality of our connections to friends, family, colleagues, peers, and community. We know that isolation is not good for us. And when we look at the causes for mental health and physical health, we don't get the whole picture unless we take into account a person's social location and the resources they have available to them. Like, where do they live? What is the culture like there? What is their economic situation? Because we know that can certainly contribute to stress and stress-related illness and mental health issues, while also impacting what supports are available and affordable for us. Another question can be, how does their experience of race or gender or sexuality or society's attitudes towards their race or gender or sexuality affect this person's well-being? So that's the first S, the social domain. And lastly, there's the spiritual, the second S in the BPSS. The broader ways in which we try to make sense of life and the world around us. This includes our ideas about integrity and how we define our ethics or morals, which doesn't have to be religious for this part of the model to be relevant. It's just kind of, I think of it as like the code you live by. It's your sense of what it means to be a good person and a good citizen on the planet, your awareness of how your presence here impacts on other beings. We can also say the spiritual part includes how you define your purpose in life, the mark you want to leave, and your wisdom, or how you make meaning out of all your collected experiences, knowing that life comes to an end for each of us. You may be noticing how this spiritual dimension can overlap quite a bit with the psychological, which is why some people put the two categories together. But the spiritual domain, I think, deserves its own category because it also includes our capacity for wonder and awe, and this connection to the mystery of being alive in a very vast universe and all that's unknowable about that, all of our questions about that, all of our existential quandaries. And it includes our sense of what is sacred and how we choose to call upon or celebrate that sacredness in different ways. So all of these arenas of experience, the biological, psychological, social, and spiritual, connect and overlap with each other because they're not separate. They're all just interactive parts of a human being. But they come together to paint this whole and complete picture of a human. They're all quite essential to who we are. And yet, if you think about it, most of the institutions we interact with in society really fail to address or even take into consideration more than one or two of these domains, right? Just think about your education. Which parts of the BPSS did your schools best address? I already talked about the medical system, right? So we thought about that one, but how about if you grew up in a religion? Was it good at addressing some, but maybe not so much other aspects of the BPSS for you? And how about your workplace or your occupation these days? Does it prioritize some parts and leave out others? You can even think about places you go like the gym, your gym. How does it address some parts of the BPSS more than others? You can just have some fun looking around and thinking about the places where you spend time and how they fit into the BPSS model. I find it kind of shocking how often we're kind of asked to compartmentalize different aspects of ourselves because we're interacting with some entity that's more equipped to deal with one or two facets of the BPSS, but not all of them. And that kind of makes sense. Like, not everything can be totally holistic, right? That's not a reasonable expectation. But where do we get to be seen and celebrated as whole selves? Where do we get to explore and experience that wholeness. This is why it's kind of amazing to look at a mindful movement class through this lens. It turns out to be kind of a rare opportunity to touch on lots of our human needs in an intentional and holistic way. And of course, it's going to depend on how we practice and what we're interested in drawing out of the practice, but let's just take some time to contemplate the possibilities. It's pretty obvious that mindful movement would interact with the bio part of the model, right? Everyone recognizes that because we're moving our body, we're affecting our body, we're doing things to our tissues, we're stretching or we're strengthening, we're affecting the bio. But I do think we sometimes get stuck in limiting our understanding of movement to mainly this bio area. Of course, in a mindful movement class, we will likely notice physical benefits and experience reduced tension or maybe fewer aches and pains or the benefits of having a more balanced nervous system, which is all really good. It might even help with issues like insomnia or high blood pressure, and all of that is huge. They may even be reason enough to practice, but there's more. Let's look at the psychological aspect of the model. This gets more engaged when we incorporate mindfulness principles into a movement class. When we're not just doing regular fitness or going through the motions of a body practice in kind of a rote way without paying that much attention, when we apply mindfulness, we can use the movement practice as a place for observing our thoughts with a non-judgmental attitude, learning how to decrease our emotional reactivity, and how to reframe limiting beliefs about the body or our capabilities, or seeing the ways that we've identified with certain traits. We can experience ourselves as strong and brave. That's both bio and psycho together. We can experience ourselves as able to take up space, or as gentle, soft, and slow. We can practice breathing calmly through a challenge and shifting ourselves back into balance after activation. Really helpful skills. We can practice observing ourselves with curiosity and non-judgment as we move and shift and engage and release and contract and expand. It's a dynamic form of mindfulness that grows our awareness as well as greater compassion for ourselves and for others. Really bringing the mindful into mindful movement makes it much juicier, and it helps us to acknowledge and tend to our psychological selves in the process. And then there's the possibility of doing all of this exploration within a group. When we practice with others or even one-on-one with a teacher, we get that social aspect of the model involved. In his teachings, the Buddha emphasized that Sangha, or friendship on the path, was crucial to practice. So doing mindful movement together fits into that idea of Sangha for me, and it naturally touches into the social domain of the BPSS. Being in a supportive class environment encourages connections between the participants. It decreases social isolation, and it instills a sense of common humanity and belonging. Like, we see each other doing the movements or doing the yoga poses together. We realize chair pose is hard for everyone, right? We have that sense of it's not just me, we're in this together. There's some research that I know I've mentioned on other episodes about how moving in sync with other people, like maybe doing a Tai Chi form where we're all moving at the same time, that this releases certain chemicals in our brain that promotes a sense of bonding, even with strangers. And we also know that empathy is connected with the same part of the brain, the insula, where our interoceptive sense of body awareness is the most active. To me, these neurobiology tidbits imply that mindful movement classes can be little sparks of community connection and social cohesion in a very divided world. And they show how the bio connects with the social in the BPSS too. Lastly, I'll come back to the mindfulness part of mindful movement to talk about the spiritual aspect of the BPSS model. Mindfulness teachings, even beyond the instructions on how to pay attention, how to be present, can be woven into movement to offer wisdom perspectives like interdependence and impermanence. And this creates a container for students to reflect, to slow down, to open to their bigger questions in direct experience. pointing to the ways that our practice can help us explore or express our values or different qualities that we'd like to have, like patience, compassion, and equanimity. This gives us an opportunity to be with what's meaningful to us. We get the chance to be available to something that feels true or sacred, however we might experience or describe that. The key to really touching on all 4 domains of biopsychosocial and spiritual is the combination of movement and mindfulness. We need both. As much as I adore sitting meditation and have immensely benefited from it and practice it every day, meditation classes without some form of movement don't always address our embodied aspects, or at least not as fully as they could. And the flip side is also true for many movement or yoga classes where the focus is decidedly physical and the psychological and spiritual needs might be there in the background but are not really tended to that skillfully. But when we bring mindfulness and movement together, a lot more becomes possible. When you think about your practice, have you considered which of these areas could use more time and attention? Are there elements of the BPSS that you haven't explored? I think we need to talk more about mindful movement and yoga going beyond the physical benefits, as great as those are, contributing to better mental health, forming important social bonds in a time of division and isolation, creating spaces where we can reflect and find meaning. I hope this discussion really helps move us in that direction of appreciating that these practices can really matter and knowing a little more about why they matter. How beautiful is it that we can include all of these BPSS domains in a communal mindful movement experience? Thanks so much for listening to this contemplation today. I do hope it's given you some inspiration or food for thought. And I always love hearing what these episodes bring up for you. So feel free to reach out through my website if you have a question or a thought or a share. I'd love to hear from you. So in the meantime, let's get out there and create more places to come together and be our full selves. Thanks again for being here. So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend, subscribe on YouTube, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find it that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, courses, or teacher trainings, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. This is Addie D. Hilster. Thanks so much for listening.